All right, let's get right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a true masterclass on how two founders literally turned a $100 retrofitted bathtub into a $250 million empire. And they did it without taking a single dollar of traditional venture capital. We're talking about Michael Garrett and Ryan Duey, the co-founders of Plunge. You see, they didn't just enter the cold plunge market, they completely dominated it. And the way they pulled it off is just an absolute blueprint for bootstrapping a high-ticket physical product.
So here's our playbook for today. We're going to break down the pandemic pivot, their pre-order cash engine, scaling the supply chain, influencers and brand building, what actually happened on Shark Tank, and finally transitioning to true scale.
Let's start with Section 1, the pandemic pivot. Before Plunge was even a thing, these guys actually owned a float spa business. And if you know anything about float spas, you know they are incredibly capital intensive. We're talking anywhere from $250,000 to $400,000 just to open the doors. But then 2020 hits, the pandemic forces those spas to close, and suddenly they have absolutely zero income. Ryan actually sold all his stuff and moved into an RV just to keep his expenses down because the RV payment was less than his rent. So they're facing this massive constraint. How in the world do you build a physical, inventory-heavy product business when you're completely broke and the whole world is shut down?
Well, the really crucial point here is that they use this massive constraint as a superpower. It's the exact thing that eventually helped them generate $250 million in cumulative revenue. Since they literally couldn't afford to manufacture a ton of units up front, they had no choice but to prove the concept immediately, and they had to do it flawlessly.
They literally started in a garage. They pieced together a prototype, turned on their Shopify store, and amazingly, they made a sale for a $4,000 unit in the very first hour. And that was with zero ad spend. They had no idea who even knew the website existed, but that initial signal, that gave them the confidence to just absolutely floor it. From there, it was pure hustle. They were in the garage cutting PVC pipes by hand. Mike would drive his van 30 minutes away to a local warehouse he found on Google, pick up a bathtub, cram it into his van, and drive back. They were doing everything manually, right down to the final local deliveries.
Moving right along to Section 2, the pre-order cash engine.
Because they had zero outside funding, they enforced a strict 6 to 8 week lead time. And honestly, this was their absolute lifeline. Think about how this works. A customer checks out and pays $4 or $5 grand up front. Michael and Ryan would then take that cash, go buy the raw materials needed for that specific order, and crucially, they had enough margin left over to buy parts for a second unit. It's brilliant. The customer was literally funding their raw material purchases. Every single time they sold one, they could afford to build two.
But this brings us to their biggest hard knocks lesson, which was learning the vast difference between a profitable P&L and actual cash in the bank. Because demand was so high, they had to buy inventory months ahead of time, which meant dealing with accrual accounting. So on paper, their profit and loss statement looked incredible, but the reality? Every single October for the first 5 years, they had zero cash in the bank, nothing. All their capital was completely tied up in an inventory that hadn't arrived or hadn't been shipped out yet. It was incredibly stressful for them.
All right, Section 3, scaling the supply chain. It's pretty wild to look at how rapidly they evolved here. Back in 2020, like we said, they were picking up local tubs and literally buying individual parts off Amazon just to get these things built. Then 2021 hits, and they're thrown right into the madness of the global supply chain crisis. At one point, they had tubs stuck at a port for 4 whole weeks. They quickly realized buying off Amazon just wasn't going to cut it anymore. So, they found a middleman in China to help source bulk parts. And that relationship deepened so much that by 2023, Plunge wasn't just buying generic parts off the shelf, they were fully co-designing their own custom chillers and acrylic tubs from the ground up. Today, they even have full-time employees on the ground in China.
Which brings us to Section 4, influencers and brand building.
Instead of dropping millions on celebrity endorsements, they just used pure authenticity and hustle. It all started when the wellness influencer Aubrey Marcus was doing an Instagram Live. Mike, who was literally sitting inside a chest freezer at the time, DM'd him and just said, "Hey, looks like you need an upgrade." Aubrey actually responded and told them to come to Austin. So Michael and Ryan rented a U-Haul, fumbled their way through packaging their first shipped unit, and drove it down there themselves. And that one organic connection changed everything. It led them to Andrew Huberman, who loved the Plunge so much he started giving them free shoutouts on his massive podcast. Huberman then connected them to skateboarding legend Tony Hawk. By hand-delivering free units to these massive figures, they created this unbelievable organic halo effect. And to back all that up, they posted these Nerd Out with Mike videos, showing radical transparency about their struggles in the warehouse and how they were hand-building the units. People just absolutely love that realness.
But getting their brand name locked down, that was a completely different story. Originally, they were called the Cold Plunge, but it was confusing customers. They desperately wanted the domain plunge.com. The catch was it was owned by a New Orleans jazz band called Plunge, who hadn't even released a record in 15 years. Michael and Ryan initially offered them 10 grand. The band went completely silent. Then, out of nowhere, a domain broker steps in, and the price absolutely skyrockets. They find themselves in a high-stakes negotiation that started at $1 million. Ultimately, they stood their ground at $250,000. And yeah, while that sounds like a crazy expense, it was a huge win. It saved them 50 grand off the broker's final asking price, and most importantly, it allowed them to secure their trademark, which their lawyers previously thought was impossible.
Okay, let's get into Section 5, the Shark Tank reality. So getting on Shark Tank is no joke. Before they even walked out, they had to sign a contract that was hundreds of pages long. Ryan actually said he stopped reading when he got to a line requiring him to acknowledge he might be humiliated on national television. The pressure is just insane. Right before the doors opened to that massive Sony Studios set with 100 people watching in dead silence, Mike's mind just went completely blank. He forgot the pitch. He couldn't even remember his own name. So what does he do? This 6'6" guy just throws his arms up and starts dancing in total silence just to force some positive vibes into the room. Ryan was absolutely terrified, but the doors opened, the adrenaline hit, and they completely nailed the pitch.
And here is the ultimate dramatic irony of reality TV for you. On stage, under all that pressure, they shake hands with Robert Herjavec on a $2.4 million deal, half equity, half loan. They hug him on national television. But the reality? After they walked off that stage, they literally never spoke to Robert again. The due diligence process with his team dragged on, Plunge's books were admittedly a bit messy from growing so fast, and the communication just completely fizzled out. But honestly, they didn't care. The episode aired, Robert went on The Ellen Show claiming he was partners with them, and Plunge got millions of dollars in free PR without giving up a single drop of equity.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, transitioning to true scale.
Remember that 8-week lead time that totally saved them in the beginning? Well, they later did a study and found a staggering statistic. They had lost roughly $20 million in sales over the years simply because of those lead times. You see, when you're the only option out there, people will wait. But as the market matured and competitors popped up, customers just weren't willing to wait 2 months for a product anymore.
So in 2023, while they were tracking toward $80 million in annual revenue, the team had this huge all-hands meeting. The founders essentially drew a line in the sand and said, real companies don't have lead times. They ran swing shifts, worked crazy overtime, and totally transitioned the business model so they could hold immediate inventory. And it was exactly the right move. Having in-stock products drastically improved their conversion rates, proving that today's consumers, who are heavily trained by Amazon, expect high-ticket items delivered almost immediately.
But holding all that inventory takes massive upfront cash. At first, to bridge that gap, they relied on merchant cash advance debt, and the founders freely admit this was incredibly taxing and stressful. They were paying high interest and were constantly pressured to pay back this aggressive debt while trying to grow the company. They knew they needed a better structure, so they opened a community equity round on WeFunder. By tapping into their fiercely loyal customer base, the very people whose lives were changed by the product, they raised $1.3 million in under 2 weeks. It completely fixed their balance sheet and deepened their community ties all at once. So, if the founders had to do it all over again, their biggest takeaways really boil down to these 3 things. First, hire a great financial planning and analysis person way before you think you actually need one. Second, deeply master your unit economics. You have to understand that a profitable P&L means absolutely nothing if your cash flow is broken. And third, be super careful with debt. If you have the chance to raise equity or lean into your community, take it, because high-stress debt can completely paralyze a growing business.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this thought. Plunge turned a global lockdown, a complete lack of cash, and the necessity of customer pre-orders into a $250 million empire. They didn't succeed in spite of their limitations. They succeeded because of them. So take a look at your own projects. What constraints or limitations are you facing today that if you just flip them on their head might become your ultimate competitive playbook? Definitely something to think about. See you next time.